Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is part 2 of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. I am your host, Kayla, and we are back with my dad today, Gary. If you have not listened to part 1, definitely go do that so that way you're not lost on the details that led us to where we are starting off with today. And we are just going to go ahead and get right into it. So the Anderson notices that the Fitzgerald is no longer on their radar. I mean, if it were you, how much would you panic? If you were like...
I think the captain of the Arthur Anderson had immediate concern and was very worried that the Fitzgerald, in his words, took a nosedive.
Okay. Oh, yes. So they're very close to Whitefish Bay at this point, right?
At this point, I think they were about 17 miles from Whitefish Bay.
Okay. So that equals out to about 28 kilometers. I try to do miles and kilometers because I have listeners who are not in America. The SS, or I guess the Anderson and the Fitzgerald, were very close to each other physically. Close enough that they expected to be able to look out off their deck and see.
At this point, with the little break in the weather that they had, which was really kind of strange, that it seemed that the Fitzgerald went down and then there is this break in the weather. But yes, Bernie Cooper thought that he should have been able to spot the Fitzgerald on the horizon, especially with binoculars. 10 miles with running lights is not a great distance on the Great Lakes, and they should have been able to spot each other. And at this point, he was not showing up on radar, so it was a huge concern. It's just, I'm sure that his stomach sank thinking about what most likely happened.
So does the radar only, I guess the radar at this point in time only show vessels that are above the water?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and it was showing the 3 blips for the salties coming out of the shelter.
Okay. Captain Cooper tried to contact the Fitzgerald for more than an hour, and the Anderson finally notified the Coast Guard, who responded at about 9 p.m. asking the Anderson to leave the bay because the Anderson, of course, continue on to Whitefish Bay to get into shelter. So the Coast Guard asked them to leave the location to return to the last known location of the Fitzgerald to search for the vessel.
Yeah, it was an interesting communication between the Anderson and Coast Guard. And I think the Anderson attempted a few times to contact the Coast Guard and express their
growing concerns.
Their growing concern, to say the least. And it seems to me, in everything that I've read, that the Coast Guard really initially kind of took things a bit lightly, and Cooper really kind of had to force the hand with each transmission that he made. There are reports even that the Coast Guard initially asked the Anderson to watch out for a 12 or 16-foot boat that was out reported missing, which is just kind of absolutely crazy if you think about that. So there was continued communication between the Arthur Anderson and the Coast Guard, and I think with each communication, the captain really tried to grow his urgency with the Coast Guard so they would take this seriously. After the hours were passing, I believe the Coast Guard really did come around, and by 9 o'clock, after the Arthur Anderson and other ships were in Whitefish Bay, they asked them to come out, which was really kind of a startling thing to ask of these captains, to turn around and go back out into the storm that they fought so hard to get into the bay. And it wasn't just a matter of the ship. You have to keep in mind, each of these ships have 20, 30 guys on board. So there's lives at stake here, not only putting their own life at stake, but putting the lives of their crew at stake. And the transmission between the Arthur Anderson and the Coast Guard here was really interesting. when the Coast Guard asked the Anderson to go out, I'm going to quote here, Bernie Cooper said, quote, "Do you realize what the conditions are like out there?" There was a pause. "You do realize what the conditions are out there, don't you?" And so it really kind of communicates the urgency in his voice that if I'm going out there, we're putting lives out there. And he continued his quote, "I'm afraid I'm going to take a hell of a beating out there." At the same time, the Coast Guard made it clear to the ships within the bay that they were the only vessels that could get to the scene and render search help. But they did make it clear to each captain that the decision was their own. So the Coast Guard really was asking these captains to go back out and look, but they were really kind of also absolving themselves of the responsibility of doing so, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the quote from Captain Cooper, in his own way, trying to express how bad the conditions are. Mm-hmm. And, if we circle back all the way back to the beginning of the story, we talked about how this has been his job for years and years. And this is not the first winter that he's been on the waters. And so for him to be like, calling the group of people that you, as someone on the water, call for help, and having them be like, "Well, we can't do anything about it right now. Why don't you go look?" And having him be like, "Wait a second, do you realize how bad it is out there? I wouldn't be calling you if I could go look myself." I think that's really telling to how bad the situation really was. And, ultimately, I don't know if any other ships decided to go out and search. Oh, wait, I do. So ultimately, Captain Cooper, I think, sort of reluctantly agreed to go look. Again, because it wasn't like the Coast Guard was saying, you have to go out and look, but they sure were putting it on that, you're the closest boats. You're going to be, you're the only hope that these guys have out there. We can't get to them, so it's up to you. But you don't have to go if you don't feel it's safe.
Yeah. I'll just interject, and this is my own personal feeling. I'll just say that it can be argued that this was not the Coast Guard's finest hour. The Coast Guard themselves seemed to respond slowly, in my opinion, to the Andersons' initial concerns. And the Coast Guard at the time had no operable ships in the close region that could respond to this emergency immediately. They did dispatch, I believe, from a distance away, a ship that arrived the following day, and they also dispatched air helicopters that arrived late on the scene late that night and early morning. Captain Cooper agreed. He went back into the storm. The William Clay Ford also joined the search, which came to include ultimately Coast Guard helicopters and airplanes that all arrived on the scene between 10:53 p.m. and 1 a.m. So if you think about the Fitzgerald going down maybe about 7:30, and really the first help getting on site at 10:53, sadly to say, not a lot that could have been done at this point.
Right. When the Anderson finally arrived at the scene to help the Fitzgerald, or to try to find the Fitzgerald and help whoever might have needed help, they found damaged lifeboats, life jackets, and other debris floating in the water, but there was no sign of the Fitzgerald and no survivors. And very quickly, do you know if they have survival suits that they can wear?
Today they do.
Yes.
There are survival suits today. Back then, I do not believe they had survival suits. They relied on their lifeboats. But in these conditions, it was said that there was no way they could have possibly launched successfully a lifeboat in those conditions. There was too much happening.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, it sounded like the Fitzgerald just went down too quickly for the men to organize any type of launch of a lifeboat.
Okay. So the Anderson continued to assist in the search efforts, but the harsh weather conditions made it difficult to locate anything, let alone being able to thoroughly search for survivors.
Truth be told, there's probably little that these ships that braved these conditions to go back out that they could do in those conditions with the waves to spot somebody, if there was somebody that did enter the water, to spot somebody in the water and to recover that person in the water, the odds would be just astronomical. And it was really just a last hope ditch effort to go out and try to look for these lives as they would have wanted done for them. And it was heroic of them to do so. I'm not sure every person would have made the decision that these guys made to go back out and look. Ultimately, there was probably little that could be done. But at the same time, I think it was just a heroic effort and something I think that they should be very proud of that they did so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think something that I did not put in here that you kind of triggered my memory in is whether you're in a boat or in the air. So whether you're in the water or in the air, looking for a person in the water is an extremely difficult job. The United States Coast Guard did a report several years ago, and I don't remember what the percentage is, but in like mild weather, moderate waves, like nothing that we are talking about here in this story, the chance that you find someone in the water and locate them by sight is like 10%. It is a very small number. And not only that, but in this particular case, you've got wind, you've got rain or snow or ice or whatever precipitation is coming down. You've got the waves that are ginormous and spraying water around as well. There's darkness. And on top of that, it's not like this is water that's in a pool. So it's dirty and it's mucky and there's dirt and there's organisms and there's all this stuff that is getting kicked up because of the aggressive waves. And, you know, it doesn't sound like anybody might have escaped the Fitzgerald once it went down, but the chances of being able to find someone when they did, with the technology that they had at the time and the circumstances surrounding everything that was happening, the drive to still go look for them is honorable, especially with the Anderson, who had been watching them and trying to help them as much as they could. The Fitzgerald was eventually found in Canadian waters 530 feet or 161 meters below the surface of Lake Superior. They were 15 miles or 25 kilometers from Whitefish Bay. No bodies were ever recovered from the wreckage, indicating that all 29 members lost their lives as the ship sank below the surface, entombing them forever in the Fitzgerald beneath the surface of Lake Superior. There was one report in 1994 that said divers did a search of the area and found a body near the wreck, but it was not recovered out of respect for the deceased and because of the wishes of the families. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was not the only ship to take damage in the storm. We already know that the Anderson was damaged in its quest to Whitefish Bay, and then in its return to help the Fitzgerald. The SS Wilfred Sykes, which was also nearby, encountered the storm and reported significant damage, including the loss of its radar and other equipment, which you said that the Fitzgerald had lost its radar.
Yes. Yeah, Fitzgerald had 2 radar antennas and lost both. And she was sailing blind during the worst of the storm.
One of the sources that I found said that there was another ship, the SS Hydrus, that sank during the same storm, but apparently it sank like 60 years prior. So don't believe everything you read on the internet, kids. In July 1977, the Coast Guard released a report of its findings, concluding that the ship sank due to the crew improperly closing hatches, which allowed the ship to take on too much water. With its loss of buoyancy, its bow dipped and was unable to recover. Because this is something that would have happened very fast, it explains why Captain McSorley was unable to send a distress signal. But he kind of, in my mind, he kind of did send a distress signal because he was telling the Anderson that they were taking on water, and that they had turned on the pumps and that they had all of this damage. And from my understanding, that's on open airwaves, which anyone could pick up on, correct?
Yeah. So talking about the sinking, in 1977, the Coast Guard released a report on its findings, concluding that the ship sank for a few reasons, but a couple, due to a low draft and also loose hatch covers that allowed tons of water into the cargo hold. Their theory was that boarding waves washed hatch covers off the deck, exposing the cargo hold to Lake Superior waters. With its loss of buoyancy, its bow dipped and it was unable to recover, and it sunk. My own personal feeling is that, as mentioned, this was a veteran crew with a veteran captain and a veteran mate, and there's no way that they sailed without having all those hatch covers dogged down, all those hatch clamps secured.
The pumps pumped water out of the cargo hold, or is there potentially water collecting in a different area of the ship that the pumps are supposed to, if they are all on and working correctly?
Well, that's the magic question, Kayla, is where was this water going into? Because obviously the Fitzgerald was taking on water because it had a list. So that's the magic question, Kayla, because obviously the Fitzgerald was taking on water because it had a list. The question still is today, where was this water coming from? Was it coming in through the hatch covers, as the Coast Guard suggests, or did it have a breach in its hull? Did it rip a hole in its hull on Caribou Island when it hit the lake bottom, if it hit the lake bottom? So the question is, was this water going into the cargo hold and flooding it and causing the list, or was it going into one of the ballast tanks? Nobody knows. I'm not sure any of us will ever know.
I just connected so many similarities between the Fitzgerald to the Titanic with that, because not necessarily because there's questions about what happened, but because, the comment about it potentially taking a nosedive and damage to the hull, and it split in half, either as it was sinking or I'm guessing shortly after it sank.
And that's another question is did it break apart on the surface, or did it break apart when it hit the bottom of the lake?
Right.
And nobody knows. It was an older ship. There was another sinking called the Carl S. Bradley, if I have that correctly. It sunk in Lake Michigan, I think around 1962 or 1963 in a storm, and the steel gave way. The ship basically sunk during a storm similar to the Fitzgerald storm, so it's not out of the question.
So the radar system is like the generic, you have like the line and it's going around like in a circle, and as it goes in that circle, it's like updating.
Right.
So as that line goes, like say the Fitzgerald is like at 12 o'clock. So as that goes past the 12 o'clock, it's like, okay, there's the Fitzgerald. But then something can happen in that time as that line is coming back around to the point where as it goes past the 12 o'clock again, the Fitzgerald is gone.
That's correct. It can be gone in one sweep of the radar screen.
Do we know how much time lapses between the radar updating?
It's seconds. It's just a matter of seconds.
I think that's quite telling too, because it would have had to go under very fast.
That's true. I never really thought about that, because if something were to happen where it was a slow process where it stopped making progress in the water, that would have been an indicator as well. But I think it was literally here one moment, gone the next.
Right.
And there's several theories in regards to how it was taking on water, whether it was through the hull, whether it was through the hatch covers. But I think a lot of people agree that at some point it literally took a nosedive. It was here and it was gone.
Yeah, especially because they were kind of relying on the Anderson to help them give directions, or to help give direction to where to go, because they had lost their own radar, so they didn't have any idea what they were going over. And so the Anderson would have been not only watching for, themselves, but also watching the Fitzgerald to make sure that the Fitzgerald was alerted to anything that might have been happening. And so, it makes sense that they would have had eyes on the screen, and it wouldn't have been like the radar updated a couple of times and then they weren't there anymore.
Right. My personal feeling, Kayla, is that the ship did ground on the shoals near Caribou Island when it took the turn in very shallow waters. And it slowly was taking on water at that point through the hull. And they had their pumps on, but the water was coming into the hull faster than they can pump it out, even with the massive pumps that the Fitzgerald had. And so it was slowly sinking. But at the same time, under those conditions, the captain really could not tell that it was slowly sinking. Or if he did, he was just trying to make that run for Whitefish Bay. But I think with the conditions that they were, that the waves just slowly overcame the ship and it lost buoyancy and it went to the bottom. And that's my personal feeling. Whether that is what happened or not, I don't know.
Well, I mean, in addition to that, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense. But in addition to that, they've only got 11.5 feet between them and the surface of the water. And that's not a lot of room. That's even, especially with the waves that they were experiencing, it would make being able to tell that distance so hard to be able to be like, oh, we're actually sinking, or to be able to tell whether the pumps were pumping out enough water or if they were slowly going down. Or, I mean, 11.5 feet is not a lot of room to adjust. And it doesn't sound like the waves, because the waves are they pull water from lower down, so like the valley between waves is lower than what the normal surface area is, or the normal surface height of the water is. And so they might have seen that and tried to calculate in their own head what the actual level of the water is, and they're like, oh no, we're still good, we're still okay, like we can make it, even if they knew that they were sinking.
Yeah, and chances are really the only ones that had an observation were those in what I'm going to call the pilot house. So you had the navigator up there, and you had the captain, and I'm sure Jack McCarthy was up there. So you had at least 3 people, probably 4 people in the pilot house, and everybody else was below deck. The engine room, of course, is below deck. Everybody else is working below deck, and they're really not seeing, they're not really conscious of really what's going on the outside.
So the waters that the Fitzgerald was found in was only 530 feet deep, which is also less than the total length of the Fitzgerald. So nose diving to the bottom is probably also a potential where, like, the, I guess, very front of the boat collided with the bottom as it was sinking, and potentially with the water and the current, if it got stuck on the bottom there, the water and the current still would have been pressing against the back end of the boat. Well, because it's there, and it could have caused the I don't know what I want to call it, the collapse of the structure, which would result in it breaking in two.
Yeah, absolutely, that could have happened if the stem of that boat hit the bottom. The force of that could actually snap that freighter in half with the force and the weight involved in the cargo hold, with the tons of the pellets that are in there. That could have easily broken that ship in half. And the reason why that ship is now found in 2 sections on the bottom of Lake Superior.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's a lot of theories out there that, they don't answer all of the questions as to what happened to the Fitzgerald and why the Anderson, who was only a handful of miles behind the Fitzgerald, survived and stayed afloat when the Fitzgerald did not. So we have theories like the freighter damaged its hull due to striking the ground near Caribou Island, like you said. There's some people who believe that there were rogue waves that rose above the deck and poured down onto the Fitzgerald, which forced enough water inside to sink it. Others claim the freighter had clear structural problems, and the lack of watertight bulkheads and a cargo load that was heavier than the ship was designed for caused it to sink. Others claim, much like the Coast Guard suggests, that the bow of the ship struck the bottom of the lake, and this was due to water coming inside because of those bulkheads not being secured down. Then there are some who believe that it was just simply overloaded and it caused the ship to crack in half on the surface and doom those locked inside. And then you have some of the crazier theories, such as UFOs or a version of the Bermuda Triangle in the Great Lakes, that are to blame. And while many investigations have been done to examine the events and the wreckage, we still do not have any answers about what happened or why the Fitzgerald sank.
Yeah, and it will never know for sure. And if you look at the photos online, there's quite a bit of video and quite a few photos that were done by different expeditions that were allowed to go down to the Fitzgerald. And many of those expeditions now anymore are off limits. But a lot of the ship is covered at this point in mud. Some of the areas that would show the hull is deeply embedded in mud. It's remarkable, though, that besides the horrible twisted metal that's down there that shows the force of the collision and everything that happened to Fitzgerald, the Fitzgerald itself is in remarkably good condition. You know, the paint still clearly shows to this day Edmund Fitzgerald on the hull. And it's a difference really between the salt water and the fresh water. You know, the salt water tends to eat and shipwrecks tend to dissolve very quickly on the oceans, where in the fresh water, especially the cold waters, when you get up in Lake Superior, it tends to preserve things. And so some of these shipwrecks look very much today like, you know, they just happened not long ago, and they might have happened decades or even centuries ago.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, you know, expeditions can't really happen anymore, and that's partially due to the request of the crewmen's families to honor their resting place. And so the Canadian government has actually limited the access to the wreckage. So in 1995, the ship's bronze bell was recovered. The bell is 200 pounds, and the recovery expedition conducted jointly with the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, National Geographic Society, the Canadian Navy, Sony Corporation, and Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. The bell is now on display in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point as a memorial to her lost crew.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Kayla, since then, they removed that bell off the ship, which to me was really surprising that they did that, but they did the right thing. When they removed the bell, they actually replaced the bell with a bell that has all the names of all 29 crewmen engraved on it. And so they took a diver, they dropped the bell down there, and the diver actually welded the bell to the deck of the Fitzgerald. It will remain there forever.
Cool. Yeah, that's a nice way to kind of memorialize the people who went down with the ship. Is the bell that they put down there like an exact replica? Do you know?
It is. I think the bell is very similar to the bell that they removed, and I believe it was bronze. And they had actually several of the family members on board the ship when they did the dive to replace the bell. And years are going on now. This goes back to, 1995. So it's been 30 years since then, and it's been now close to 50 years since the sinking of the Fitzgerald. And I was much younger. I think I was in 8th grade when the Fitzgerald sank, and I always try to remember back to that time. And to be honest with you, I can't remember it too well. I just remember items being flashed on the screen, on like the news, that they would have a scroll that there was a ship that was missing, and it was the talk in school the following day. And that's about all I can remember, because it was 50 years ago, and I think I was in 8th grade at the time. But it's always fascinated me, living in the Great Lakes area and having a tie, I think, to this industry. It's just always been a area of fascination for me.
Yeah, and you said when we were talking about this like a week or two ago that there were a couple of the men on the ship that had like premonitions, like that they shouldn't be there.
Yeah, so there's a very good book that I think Kayla referenced, The Gales of November by Robert Heming, that really personalizes this tragedy. It's just not about the ship, but that there were 29 men on this, and it just does reference a few of the men just having premonitions of trying to reach out one last time to family members, sometimes in unusual ways that they may not have done previously. And even the cook whose I believe his last name was Rafferty. He was replacing the cook that had stomach ulcers, and he really wanted off the ship. He thought he was going to get off the ship in Duluth, and turns out that the person that had stomach ulcers continued to have issues, so they asked him to stay on, and from all accounts, he was very disappointed in that news. But there was just several personal accounts that were relayed through family members of just little things that happened before, postcards even that were sent of things that you would almost think that were premonitions.
Okay. So before we fully wrap up this episode, I wanted to list the names of those on board and lost their lives on the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. This is in alphabetical order by last name, so there's no titles or indication of who handled what. We talked about a couple of the people already. So we've got Michael Armagost, Frederick Beecher, Thomas Benson, Edward Bindon, Thomas Borgson, Oliver Champeau, Nolan Church, Ransom Cudney, Thomas Edwards, Russell Haskell, George Hull, Bruce Hudson, Alan Kalman, Gordon McLellan, Joseph Mazes, John McCarthy, Ernest McSorley, Eugene O'Brien, Carl Peckel, John Povich, James Pratt, Robert Rafferty, Paul Ripa, John Simmons, William Spengler, Mark Thomas, Ralph Walton, David Wise, and Blaine Wilhelm.
These men, Kayla, you're absolutely right, should be remembered, and all that lost their lives on the Great Lakes and the oceans. It's not an easy job, and my hat's off to all of them. They keep our industries running. They keep our houses warm. Mm-hmm. They provide steel for the automobile industry, and their service is to be recognized. So to me, it remains a mystery, but the fact is 29 men were lost.
29 husbands, brothers, friends, 29 working guys providing for their family the best way they could, for some, the only way they knew. So it is appropriate that they are remembered. Each year on November 10th at the Maritime Sailors Cathedral in Detroit, Michigan, the bell is rung 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And with that, do you have any last words? Any last things?
That's it for me.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me, Dad. Kayla. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.